Hey there, thanks for joining me for the second round of videos in the Romans 13, 1-7 series. This is a feedback / question video as promised because many of you watched and a couple of you had a chance to respond back with some reflections, and I thought as promised I would take some time to address those. So in this particular video I'm going to be talking about the idea of evil. Specifically evil as it relates to governing authorities. Because the whole context of the first couple of verses that we've read and studied together have really been related to this idea of submission to governing authorities, but with the idea mostly of governing authorities that do not violate the standards of God. But in one of the videos, I read a quote from Kenneth Boa and William Prudner that says, "The Christian is called upon to submit to governing authorities when their standards do not violate the standards of God." So I unpacked that, I think, a pretty good amount in the previous videos, but I think there's still this question of what is evil, and that there's something that's different between standards within a governing structure that are uncomfortable, that we don't like, and things that clearly are in violation of God's standards. And I talked about how we work through and discern those things in community. But part of the reason why I like this question of when is earthly authority evil, I think it's important to really at least set some clear foundations. And so I've been processing that question since I received it. And I've come up with two things as it relates to clear examples where we can see a violation of God's standards. I think standards there's certainly a scale where there can be extreme and then there can be like low impact. But interestingly, I think both of these standards start in the low, like maybe even innocently enough. But then if we continue to allow them to grow in society and culture, and we continue to not push back, that it can get to very extreme examples. So what I'm saying is ultimately, we're talking about evil and earthly authority, is that it may start with an individual idea in a person, but what I'm trying to address is how that individual idea can transform into really an institutional direction that we are supposed to be submissive to, but really violates the standards of God. Hopefully that's clear. The two examples that I have come across, at least in my thinking, is the idea of dehumanization, and then the second one would be destruction of community and interdependence. So let me do the first one as it relates to dehumanization and how that violates the standards of God. So the Imago Dei is this theological description that you may or may not be familiar with that really deals with the idea of us being made in God's image, right? So if you were to look for a scriptural basis, you could look early on in Genesis, and it's in Genesis 1:26-27. And the translation I'm just going to read from is the Common English Bible, but you may have a different one that you can check out. But this is where the idea of Imago Dei or image bearing comes from. Let me read it for you. It says, "Then God said, 'Let us make humanity in our image to resemble us, so that they may take charge of the fish of the sea, the birds in the sky, the livestock, all the earth, and all the crawling things on earth.'" Verse 27. "God created humanity in God's own image. In the divine image God created them. Male and female God created them." And so that's where the origins of this theological perspective of being image bearers of God takes place. I like this translation because it uses the word humanity, and it's not to necessarily further an argument. In particular, it's one that I use, but the Hebrew actually says him, but him is still refers to the idea of humanity, of all of humanity, right? And so there's something in the creation story in Genesis that really talks to us about who God is, his character towards us, and how he creates us. And somehow in his creation of humanity is that we reflect him. There's all sorts of debates and discussions in theology around this idea, and then also in terms of image bearing, what happened when sin entered into the picture, and how does that mar the image that we carry of God. At a most fundamental level, though, I think that we could say that part of the human or humanity experience is that we all reflect a creator. I think that's a basic definition that we could all get behind, hopefully, right? But this idea that in some way, in some form, we reflect as created beings a creator. And then Genesis tells us is that we have like the maker's mark, is that somehow we are reflections of that creator too. And so there is some intrinsic value and an importance and worth. When I say some, I mean like a whole lot of humanity. And so when we talk about humanity as it relates to one another, so this whole idea of loving one another and being loved by one another, is that we're really perpetuating the beauty of our creation and our image bearing. And so it is, as we love one another, we're reflecting God's love to one another, and it's this flourishing that takes place because of love, of tending to the image of God in one another. And it doesn't just require the person in front of us to be, for example, a Christian in order to say that you have value and worth and significance. Now, when we talk about dehumanization, that means basically the opposite of everything that I just said, is that there is this process where we say that when we look to someone, that they are somehow less than us, that they hold less value than us. Some of the more extreme examples of that can clearly be seen in situations like genocide. So I'm talking about the Holocaust or the Rwandan genocide, or even a modern day example of that that's going on right now is the Uyghur Muslims in China. In all three of those instances, we see not just individuals, but we see institutions or government structures that have perpetuated the idea of dehumanizing other people. So there has been an established group of people, there's been whatever their identity markers are, that are deemed as less than compared to those that are in power. One example of this that was really impactful for me, I was listening to a podcast about the reconciliation that's taking place in Rwanda post the early 90s and the genocide that was experienced. And one of these activities that's taking place is almost the rehumanization. It's really talking about the value and intrinsic worth that we all have as humanity. But part of the reason why that needs to be reestablished is because during the process of the genocide, you had figures of authority that were the majority and that were defining people as less than and using terms like cockroaches. Now, if you've ever seen a cockroach, what is your natural sort of internal reaction is one of disgust, but also destruction. And that is, again, an extreme example of dehumanization. But we're talking about, again, when is earthly authority evil? Well, earthly authority is evil when it continues to perpetuate the lies that people are less than or hold less value. Is that somehow the image bearing that we carry is only extends so far. There are certainly examples within Christianity of that, within American society and culture, and even in the formation of society. For example, another example of the dehumanization of people would be slavery. Again, that's an extreme example, but the dehumanization can start in simple things and small things like bigotry. But the more institutionalized that becomes, the greater the evil that is perpetuated because the scale multiplies, right? So I think that when we're talking about earthly authority being evil, I can at least look to that as an example. Like my antenna should pop up if I'm starting to see things where the people that I'm meant to submit to are devaluing or dehumanizing other people. Another example that I mentioned, which was the second one, was the destruction of interdependence. And what I mean by that is, if you notice, the first example is really the love of one another, love of neighbor, right? But then there's also this destruction of interdependence, which is to not just love, but to be loved. And I think that this is far more subversive, but also very insidious in culture and society, which is to say that there are potentially institutions that, this feels like a conspiracy theory, I promise you it's not. I want to use an example like Civil War, is that there were things that were perpetuated by governing authorities that were actually pitting people against one another. So it wasn't just this idea of devaluation, it was also saying, this is how you're different, and because of that, you should connect. I think part of the reason why it's trickier to explain that is because it's this thing that we can feel, but we may not be able to see. I don't know if you've ever been in situations where you feel like when you enter into a room and there's a group of people and there's just that awkward air. I think that this one is far more insidious and subversive, and not as clear, but it's this idea of separating us from one another, because realistically we were created to be dependent on God. But in that, as I've said in the past, is that we are created, and specifically Christ followers are saved into a community. And furthermore, just in our creation, and we talk about image bearing, is this idea of the Trinity being a perfect reflection of community, a perfect love community, Father, Son, and Spirit. And they are bound together perfectly. And we are made out of that. We are made to be dependent to God, but also we are made to be interdependent, is that we aren't meant to live this life alone, is that we are meant to come alongside of people shoulder to shoulder. And so when I say that when earthly authority can be evil is when it's in contrast to that, where it's trying to distort or destruct the things that bind us together. And so this idea of governments, it may just be small, but again, it may not be to the grand or as obvious scale of dehumanization, but it's constantly pressing that nerve of, this is where you're different, this is how you're different, this is why you should do this. And so rather than creating helpful dialogue so that way we can connect, it's pointing out all of our differences, and that's destructive. And I think it's contrary to the idea of God's kingdom being restorative and one of reconciliation. And so in many ways, that is very against Christ, or it's very anti-Christian or very anti-Christ. And so these are things that can also violate the standards of God. But I will say, the first example of dehumanization is far clearer and more overt and obvious. But I think part of the way that we get to those obvious places is first and foremost by just the destruction of things that bind us together in love, even in our differences. This is part of the reason why I'm even doing these videos, is so that way we can, with one another, wrestle through things that make us uncomfortable in our society today. So hopefully that at least gives you two examples or two reflections on two, I think, clear ways that government structures that we should be submissive to need to be pushed back on because they're in violations of God's standards. I'd love to hear your thoughts and feedback on that one. You may have to do like a question and answer sort of thread and then continue with the Roman series as well. But hopefully that in some small way answers the question. Thanks.